Now this is what makes the Romans hot and mad, is the Romans write history. Now this is the empire of Parthia, which is very underrated in today's mainstream historical records, that these people had the Romans by the short hairs.
Ooh.
So when everyone's done looking at this map, you can go to the next slide.
Are we good?
No. Some of the text is hard to read, but okay. All right, so now Josephus writes extensively about these people, about Parthia as well. Now, in Josephus's book, The War of the Jews, he originally wrote this book in a Semitic language, so the surrounding nations beyond the Euphrates, remember he mentioned that, so could understand his writings. Now, since he was a Pharisee, he wanted nothing to do with people that weren't his Semitic kinsmen. But he wrote this book specifically for these surrounding nations, the Parthians, the Scythians. Now, most modern versions of that book are translated from his Greek translation, but he didn't want to write it in Greek. Josephus wrote, "I have proposed for the sake of such that live under the government of the Romans to translate these books into the Greek tongue, which I formerly composed in the language of our own country and sent it to the upper barbarians." And in a footnote of Josephus's War of the Jews book, the footnote for barbarians identifies them as Parthians, which is what mainstream history calls them. Now, was he taking a jab at the Romans? Like, oh yeah, they're barbarians like you say they are. But Josephus regarded the Parthians were familiar with Hebrew, or Syro-Chaldaic. So, he knew these people had the same common origins as him. Now, the people of Parthia were subject to the Persians for a while. The Persians refer to them as Partha, and they eventually revolted. Now, you're going to notice this pattern. Many times in history, the ousted Parthian kings sought refuge with the Saki tribes of the Scythians, or when they were out of soldiers, they'd get reinforcements from the Sakis. And why would they bother going to these people if they had no connection? Now, the alphabet in use in Persia, and as you know from the books of Esther, the book of Esther, that a lot of Israelites, particularly Judah, was in captivity in Persia, and so they did use a common alphabet. The alphabet used in Persia at that time was based upon Aramaic, at least from the time of the Arsacid dynasty. We're going to find out who the Arsacid dynasty is. Now, Acts chapter 2, when Pentecost, or Shavuot, whatever you call it's mentioned, it mentions the Parthians were there. Now, the average reader, they're reading this and think, well, those are just people from the Asian areas coming to get converted or something. But now, the New Testament translated from Greek calls them Parthians, but they were known by other names too. So to the average person, this glances over on who these Parthians really are and why they're coming to Pentecost. So a prominent city of Parthia was named Assak. Another one, Samarian, and its chief city was called Gaza. Once again, there's a lot of similarities to their old culture. And if you go to the next slide, in Jeremiah 33:17, there's a prophecy. It says, "For thus saith Yahweh, David shall never," well, some translations say, "shall never lack a man to sit upon the throne of the house of Israel." So here it says there will always be an heir for David. And if you go to the next slide, now, a lot of the Parthian royalty Some of the names of the kings were called Phraides, Phraiordes, or Phratakes. These are just Hellenized forms of Phares, which is the royal line of Judah. And we're going to see the connections. They were the names for some of the Parthian kings and some of the kings of Iberia. Remember the Iberian Peninsula and Hibernia? Were named Pharismanes. Again, the kings of these nations have eerily similar names rooted in Pharis, just in Hellenized Greek and Latin forms. At least that's what the history books calls them. So, Jehoiakim, one of the last kings of Judah, was carried captive to Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar. We find about this in 2 Kings 25. 37 years later, I think he was found in a dungeon or something, I forget. But he became a vassal king of later Babylonian kings. So here we see the royal line of Judah. They often become subordinate kings of other higher kings. And we're going to see this pattern with the Parthians too. First Chronicles chapter 3, verses 16 through 24 shows that the royal family of Judah did not die out, but produced many descendants during the generations after the fall of Jerusalem. Now, what's curious about the Parthians is that they always insisted that the blood members of the Arsacid family were the rulers. I'm good, thanks. They only let blood members of this royal lineage be the rulers in the Parthian Empire. We're going to find out what this Arsacid dynasty is, and you go to the next page. The historian Diodorus noted that the Parthians passed from the dominion of the Assyrians to that of the Medes, to a similar position under the Persians. George Rawlinson also noted that other earlier historians regard the Parthians as exiles. It's interesting they're calling these people exiles. What are they exiled from? The Parthians revolted and placed themselves under Scythian protection. You're going to see they do this a lot. After the fall of the Persian Empire, Parthian territory fell into the hands of the Greeks under Alexander the Great. After Alexander the Great died, the division of his kingdom was ruled by the, I don't know how to pronounce this, like Seleucid Greeks. Now in 256 BC, the provinces of Parthia and Bactria, which is ruled by the Greeks, revolted against these said Greeks. Arsaces is where the Arsacid dynasty comes from. The first king of the Parthians was a chieftain of a Scythian tribe, the Dahanites. Although some contend he was a Bactrian, but this is all in the same geographical area. However, the first king of the Parthians was actually initially a Scythian. And they kept going back for Scythian protection and had an odd relationship with them because they clearly have a common root. Now, in Numbers 26, verses 35 through 36, the sub-tribes or clans of Ephraim were named the Bachrites, the Aaronites, and the Tahanites. Now, when you see this word Dahanites, now typically when we see these names we do think of Dan, and we'll get into that later, but in this case, because of the linkage to the tribe, the clans of Manasseh mentioned in Numbers, the Dahanites are actually the Tahanites, so that's not Dan, it's more or less a root in a Ephraimite tribe. Now, notice that name, Aaronites. Now, Iran was an Ephraimite clan, like I mentioned. Iran is derived from Aaron. And Pahlavi was an old Persian tongue and had strong Semitic traits. We already established the Persians used an Aramaic alphabet. They did take, did have a lot of the Israelites captive, particularly Judah, the book of Esther. So Pahlavi sounds a lot like Levi, and Iran comes from Iran. Now, the Persians, the Persians, I'm not saying that they're The people in Iran today are Hebrews. However, the reason why some of the names bear the same resemblance is because of who lived there at the time. So this is an exception to the rule. So anyway, you just go to the next slide. Oh, you did, okay. Now Parthia rose to power while the empire of Carthage began to die out during the Second and Third Punic Wars. When Arsaces died, the first king of Parthia, he was replaced by his brother Tiridates. And Tiridates named a mountain fortress in Parthia Dara. In the 1 Chronicles 2:6, that was the name of a patriarch from the tribe of Judah. The Seleucids, those Greeks, emerged 40 years later, and they temporarily recaptured the Parthian capital city, but after the war ended, they signed a peace treaty and relinquished it. Now, the next monarch, Mithridates I, by the time of his death, had placed Bactria, Media, Babylonia, Persia, and other territories under Parthian rule. That map you saw, that's why the Parthian Empire was so big. Now, in 129 BC, the Seleucids attack again with 400,000 troops. The Parthian Empire on their own only numbered 120,000 troops, but had Scythian reinforcements, and they defeated the Seleucid monarch Antiochus, along with 300,000 of his host army. Now the Maccabees also helped to pick off some of those Seleucids Greeks to gain their independence. If anyone knows of the book of Maccabees, where Hanukkah comes from, well, you'll have some knowledge of that. But then you go to the next slide. Now, this is kind of a funny story here. The Scythians arrived, not the reinforcement, but some other Scythians came long after this battle was over. Now, after the battle was over, they came over here to fight, and they wanted to split the booty with the Parthians. But King Phraates I said, no, you're not getting anything because you didn't fight. So then the Scythians attacked them. Now, this parallels an event in Judges chapters 11 and 12. After winning a great victory over the Ammonites, the armies of the Gileadites, which are the tribes of Manasseh, Gad, and Reuben, were joined by Ephraim after the battle was already won. They came when the battle was over, and they said, over here to fight. And because Manasseh wouldn't give Ephraim any war booty, they fought each other over this treasure. And this Parthian-Scythian battles is basically a rerun. This kind of stupid stuff brothers fight over, I guess. And so then, an eastern portion of the Parthian Empire was invaded by a number of nomadic Saki, the Scythians, migrating southward out of the Caspian Sea region. They named their new homeland Sakastani, and after some territory disputes, they merged with Parthia. Their empire got even bigger. So you can go to the next slide. Now, the Parthian government, and we're almost done with Parthia, this is going to be over pretty soon. Hope it wasn't too long or boring or anything, is that the Parthian government was ruled by the royal house, or the Arsacid dynasty, and the Senate. The Senate consisted of the wise men and the magi, the priestly class. Remember those terms, because you're going to see something very familiar. Now the kings, even though they had to be from the royal bloodline, the Arsacid dynasty, they were elected by the two houses. They pick the blood descendants of the Arsacids and then elect them. And the power of the kings could be checked by the royal council, and the kings could even be recalled. This was an early version of a parliament. And the vassal kings ruled underneath the main king, as we saw from that king of Judah. That was the vassal king of the Babylonians, much like the medieval feudal system. Now, Pliny and Tacitus, who were Roman historians, noted that the Parthians held municipal elections for people to elect city council members. So we see a lot of firsts. We see a senate. I don't know if the Romans had a senate first, but they had a parliament, a feudal system, and elections, and these aren't in mainstream history books today. These were revolutionary concepts. And Parthians just glanced over like it was nothing. And so then you go to the next page. Now, this was the Parthian Magi, the priestly class, or the wise men. Now, you notice the head coverings the Parthian Magi are wearing. Again, that is very similar to what the Scythians wore. It's kind of a mitre-shaped hat. And so, really, I mean, if anyone's that tired, let's finish this. All right, so then you go to the next slide. I didn't realize it would be this long. It's only like 100 slides, but...
It's good. Keep going. We love it.
And so Rome became embroiled in a war with Armenia, and the Parthians remained neutral at first. Then Rome convinced the Parthians to team up with them in an alliance. The Romans said to the Parthians, if you help us, then you get to keep some of your territories. And so, but then Rome double-crossed them, as after the Parthians helped the Romans defeat the Armenians, the Parthians tried to go occupy their territories and were blocked by the Romans. And so then King Phraates was assassinated by his sons Mithridates and Orodes, and then Mithridates banished Orodes, and they got split up. Now, you're going to find out why the Romans changed this history, why they have such a hate on for these people, especially the Parthians. We're going to find out soon. Now, Crassus, a prominent Roman consul and a ruling, he had a trifecta ruling government system with Julius Caesar and Pompey. Crassus decided to launch a first in a series of campaigns of wars against the Parthians. He wanted to subjugate the Parthian Empire, make them his servants, and make the Roman Empire even bigger. Now, at first, Crassus just decided to loot the Middle East. He even stole gold from the temple in Jerusalem. Now, Parthia taunted Crassus. They were basically calling him a coward and enraged him to invade them. Now, Parthia got a one-up on Crassus by invading Armenia with their infantry to prevent Armenia from giving Rome aid. And then they used their own Parthian cavalry to fight Rome and keep them at bay. So again, very strategic people. These weren't uncivilized barbarians. Yes. Now, this is what the Parthian cavalry looked like. Now, this would scare the crap out of any Roman. They say, oh, these people are uncivilized barbarians, crude, no technology. The Romans are superior. The Romans didn't have armor like this. And you notice they had a medieval feudal system. Where do you think this armor was used later? Where did they get it from? And so, when you go to the next page. Now, their Israelite ancestors actually had armor like that too. You see it in 2 Chronicles 26, verse 14. And Uzziah, that's a king from the line of Judah and Pharis, just like the Parthian royalty, prepared for them throughout all the host shields and spears and helmets, and I don't know what that word is, some old English word, habergeons, and bows and slings to cast stones. So the Israelites had similar armor, what the Parthians wore, and they had to get it from somewhere, and then we saw that later on in medieval Europe. Now, the Romans suffered one of their worst defeats at the hands of the Parthians. 40,000 casualties, 10,000 captives, and the rest of them ran away. Now you know why the Romans don't like the Parthians. It's going to get worse for the Romans from here. The cavalry of the Parthians was commanded by Cyrannus, who sent the head of Crassus to the Parthian king in Armenia, who then made peace with Parthia. So Parthia and Armenia, they got merged into that empire too, and you'll see the significance of that later. So Parthia later retaliated in 40 BC for Rome's invasion, or what Crassus did. They're still angry about, and they conquered some Roman territories. including Syria, Asia Minor, and Palestine. Those same territories the Scythians conquered a couple hundred years before that, or a few hundred years actually. Now Parthia controlled Palestine for only a few years, just like the Scythians did, before Antigonus, the Parthian ruler of Palestine, was replaced by King Herod, his Roman-sponsored replacement. So now we're just going to mention briefly the time of Yeshua, and we're going to see the significance of how Parthia ties into this, what a lot of people don't realize. So you go to the next slide. I think it's in, oh, let's go to this one. No, this doesn't seem right. Can you just go through a few slides? Oh yeah, no, it's right. You go back to the previous one. There's something. Okay, now, yeah. Since any Arsakid from the dynasty could be king, there was often a lot of infighting, banishing, and assassinations for relatives to usurp the throne. We saw it a lot. Now, Phraates IV killed his father Orodes. That one guy got banished earlier. The chaos prompted another Roman invasion because they see, well, these guys are fine with each other, we're going to pick on them again. And this war campaign was headed by Mark Antony, real famous guy, in 37 BC. Now, the Parthians wiped out Rome's columns, slaying 10,000 men. Antony then admitted defeat with winter on the rise to shelter his cold and starving soldiers. The Parthians were smarter than the Romans in terms of strategy and fighting in the cold, and we're going to see that later on. This caused Roman tension with Armenia ever since, in which Mark Antony acted very cruelly towards the Armenians. Now, in 1 AD, right at the turn of the century, when another battle between Rome and Parthia was about to happen, a treaty was negotiated between Phraates and Caius Caesar, Augustus Caesar's grandson. And we're going to go to the next slide now. Now, what is this treaty? Rome and Parthia had a peace treaty. And we see evidence of this in the time of Yeshua, reading between the lines. Now, remember how the Parthian Magi, or the wise men, the priestly tribe? Well, the wise men or the Magi were the ones that visited Yeshua. They were evidently Parthian Magi, because you see this peace treaty between them. We're going to get into more evidence that these Parthian Magi were descendants of the Levites. They were priestly people. Now, contrary to popular belief, the Magi did not visit Yeshua as an infant. You always see those little paintings of, the baby Messiah with the wise men over him. They didn't visit him as a baby. In Matthew 2:11, it says they visited him as a young child. It doesn't say what age. And because in Luke chapter 2, it mentions shepherds visiting Yeshua as an infant. It doesn't mention the Magi. The Magi didn't come till later. Now, Matthew 2, verse 8 adds that King Herod sent the Magi to Bethlehem after conferring with the Jewish hierarchy about the prophesied location of the Messiah's birth. Now, the Pharisees knew where the Messiah would be. They had the Tanakh, the Old Testament. They read Micah and Daniel. And they were, Herod wanted to know where he was. It's evidently, that's why he wanted to kill all the firstborn. He didn't want anyone to usurp his rule. Now, Herod conferred with the Parthian delegation. He was trying to interrogate them. Where was this star that the Magi followed? Where was it? I want to, go where they're going. He apparently learned this period of time was almost 2 years, because he killed all male children in Bethlehem under 2 years of age in an attempt to kill the Messiah. So if you go to the next slide. All right, now, earlier in Matthew chapter 2, indicates that all of Jerusalem was troubled. It used that word troubled when the Parthian Magi arrived. Now, why were they troubled? Why were they scared when these guys came in? Well, knowing the Parthian Empire, these Magi, they were the priests. They didn't come alone. They obviously had armed escorts and everything. We're going to see evidence of that later on. Now, the Magi, after they followed the star, they were asking Herod for direction. They say, we want to see he that is born king of the Jews. Now, why did Herod bite his tongue? Because he was a hothead. Why didn't he say to the Magi, well, I'm the king of the Jews and you ain't going to see this guy? He shut up. You know why he shut up? Because the Parthians and the Romans had a peace treaty. Yes, the Magi were the priestly class. Herod could not talk back to them. He had to shut up around them.
Wow.
Now, Matthew 2, chapter 9 states that the star stood over where the young child was. That's Yeshua. Now, most people interpret this to mean, you know, a constellation, something in the sky, like they follow something in the sky. But that is not the case, because the scriptures periodically uses the word star to represent an angel, especially in Revelation. No comet or celestial phenomenon could pinpoint the exact location of a city, let alone a child. The star stood over where Yeshua, the young child, was. Now, Matthew 2:2 states the Magi saw the star. It doesn't say anyone else saw it, only they did. Otherwise, Herod and his astrologers would have saw it, and they wouldn't have needed to ask the other Parthians about the star. He would have known, because he had astrologers.
Sure.
If it was in the sky, why did Herod need to ask information? And the star disappeared. Once the Magi got in Judea, then they had to ask Herod for directions. I present to you that this star was an angel guiding the Magi, because they were the Levites, to go anoint the high priest,
Wow.
Yeshua.
Wow. Wow. I like that. That's totally that's a really good possibility.
Ever. Say it again.
That's
What, read this whole
wow.
part again?
No, what did you say? Just your summary.
No, the descendants of the Levites, the priests, were following the angel, because Yahweh used an angel to speak to his priests to go find where the Messiah was to anoint their high priest.
Yes.
And you wouldn't know that if you didn't know the history of Parthia or Scythia or any of these places. And we're going to be done in about probably like 20, 30 minutes, so thanks for staying this long.
Wow.
If we go to the next slide.
That was worth all of it right there.
Yeah, man.
Yeah, it was amazing. That's very good.
Thanks. I was fascinated when I found that out too.
And you didn't tell your mother beforehand. Gosh.
Like you said, you read the Stephen Collins books.
20 years ago.
Oh. Okay, now, when Parthian, we're going to just briefly describe the fall of Parthia and where the other tribes were dispersed to and where they are today. Now, when the Parthian Roman affairs were calm, Parthia fought and lost a war over Armenia to an alliance of Iberians and Scythians, headed by King Pharasmanes. Now, the Iberians and the Scythians fought Parthia and won the country of Armenia. Now, when the Parthian king Artabanus lost this war, he fled to the other Scythians for refuge. We've seen that pattern all along. They go to the Scythians for help, but there was many tribes, and they kind of did their own thing as they were nomads. So, the Arsacid dynasty was in a state of great turmoil, which ended in 51 AD with the death of a cruel emperor, the Parthian emperor Gotths. He sought to eliminate all rivals to his throne by murdering all the close and distant male relatives, including children and pregnant wives. Kind of like what Herod was doing, but on an even worse scale. Then you go to the next slide. Now, towards the end of the 1st century, the Parthians established friendly relations with the Dacians, a people living along the Danube River who disliked the Romans too. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. Now, the year after the death of the Parthian emperor Mithridates IV, the Roman emperor Trajan, that's how you pronounce it, broke the Roman-Parthian peace treaty. He got rid of it, and he began a military campaign against Parthia. Now notice when all this was happening, that was after Yeshua's adult ministry. And I didn't really get into it, but because of the Parthian-Roman peace treaty, he was really only harassed by the Pharisees, the Jewish religious leaders. The Romans didn't have too much of a problem with them. Because if he was good with the Parthian priestly class, the Romans didn't really want to touch him. And Pontius Pilate was trying to save Yeshua, but he gave in to the pressure of the Pharisees, and that's when this peace treaty was starting to dissolve. So they really didn't care about keeping peace with Parthia. Now, when wintering in Antioch of Syria, the Roman Emperor Trajan barely made it out alive. He was going to attack the Parthians, and a destructive earthquake struck 9 cities in Roman provinces, including in Asia Minor and Greece. He's going to attack the Parthians, and this earthquake happens and almost kills him. This is kind of odd. Now, Trajan took a pleasure voyage down the Tigris River into the Persian Gulf. He was just goofing off, full of himself. And while he was goofing off, the recently conquered Parthian provinces rebelled on a massive scale and burned Seleucia, other major cities, and exterminated an entire division of the Roman Empire. Well, this dude was going on his pleasure cruise. Now, the Roman armies suffered from heat stroke, swarms of flies, famine, and violent hail and thunderstorms. The Roman historical records account that these flies were literally picking the food and water out of their hands.
What?
Yeah. And before this, the Roman emperor was almost killed by an earthquake. These are acts of Elohim, because the Romans are trying to attack his chosen people, and this isn't,
Where can we read about this?
Well, I'm getting to that. And this isn't BS, because this is in Roman historical records. They cut down Parthia, but they'd have to admit this, although it's embarrassing to them. So you go to the next slide. Now the Parthians then assembled their largest army ever, and was the fiercest and bloodiest battle ever fought between the two empires. The new Roman emperor, Macrinus, tried to appease the Parthians. Is this slide out of order? Can you go to the next one? Oh no, go back. I think I missed a slide, but I remembered what it said. Oh, you can go to the next one. Yeah, I forgot to put some. Now, the Roman historical records, I don't remember the source, but you can find this in main Roman history books. When all these acts of Elohim were happening, the earthquakes, the flies taking their food, the famine, the heat stroke, they didn't know who the God of Israel was. They thought the Romans recently stole treasure from a temple of Apollo, because they conquered the Greeks, just renamed their gods. They looted their temples. They thought a Greek god was attacking them. In their historical records, they said the magic of the Chaldeans was attacking us. They knew this was supernatural, and they thought someone was casting sorcery on them. But it was the Almighty, protecting those lost tribes. So anyway, the Parthians defeated the Romans, their biggest victory ever. This battle lasted for 3 days. And George Rawlinson accounts that the body count was so high, these bodies were about 50 feet high, and people couldn't even see in front of them. They were just getting stacked like dominoes.
Wow.
And then Macrinus, the Roman emperor, fled the scene after getting massacred, and he agreed to pay the Parthians reparations of 50 million denarii. Now, a denarius is a Roman coin. I don't know what that's worth, but he paid them 50 million bucks of Roman money for their lost casualties. Now, you see why the Romans want to put down the Parthians? This is flat out humiliating to them. And plus, secular historical records don't want the Bible to be validated, because how else do you explain these earthquakes, these flies? Well, you guys know who did that. Now, the Parthian king, Artabanus IV, sought guidance from an occult soothsayer, and was told, a soothsayer, kind of
A fortune teller.
a fortune teller, a witch. And the soothsayer told him the Parthian Empire was about to end. Now, doesn't this sound similar? When King Saul sought the witch of Endor, She told him that he was about to die and his empire was to fall. And Artabanus IV was history being repeated, and he did end up dying. In 220 AD, the province of Persia revolted, and in a series of 3 battles, ending in a Persian victory 7 years later, the Parthian Empire ended, and King Artabanus IV lost his life. Yahweh spoke through an occult soothsayer, because he sought the counsel of a familiar spirit, and what's the penalty for Amnitor? Death. And how he protected the Parthians before with his mighty power, that he said no more. I'm ending you. And so then we go back to this map again. Since everyone saw this, we can skip if you want. I'm just going back to again in case people need to look at it again. And so these are the final migrations. It's just like a few slides. And then we'll get into how we can trace the tribes today. And then this is almost over. Thanks for watching. So after the fall of Parthia, the remaining population had to make a speedy migration. They couldn't, dilly-dally around. They had to get out of there. Now, they couldn't migrate to the west of the Parthian Empire because that was where the Romans were. The south was the Arabian desert and the sea, and to the east and the northeast were expanding Oriental populations. Probably, like some of the Huns, actually, I remember now. Some of the Huns, and Genghis Khan, and people like that. So a lot of these areas were hostile and not safe refuges. And these Asian tribes, these Huns and all, they drove out the Massageti and other Scythians westward into Parthia centuries ago. The Parthians and the Scythians are all together. So there was only one safe direction, and that was northwest. Because their kinsmen, the Scythian and the Dacians, were there. Remember, the Parthians made an alliance with the Dacians as they both hated the Romans. They remembered, oh, I made a pact with these guys, I can go hide with them. And of course, they're always running to the Scythians. Can't do anything on their own. So, the Scythians and the Dacians at this time inhabited a region roughly equivalent to modern Romania and portions of Hungary. The Parthian province, there was one province that the Persians didn't destroy at that time that maintained its independence and Arsacid ruler, the Arsacid dynasty. That country was Armenia. And so, go to the next slide.
Oh, hold on a minute.
No, I remember that.
Wait. Better change up.
Blow my nose here for a second. You guys figure out where that's from where. Okay, so, where was I? Oh, yes. So the Parthian refugees, go to the next one, fled to Armenia. So you go to the next slide. Now, they traveled through Armenia to a region that used to be called the Caucasus Mountains. Now, once again, this has some bad blood associated with this term. As Caucasus Mountains is where we get Caucasian from. But the way people use it today is incorrect. Caucasian does not mean all white people. Because actually anthropologists will tell you there's Caucasians that are dark-skinned. The original people of the Caucasus Mountains were dark-skinned, actually Arabs. They're Semitic people, even Asiatic Indians are Caucasian. So you just need to clear that up. Is when you say Caucasus Mountains, some people are in that freaked out, but the way they use the term different is the way they use it now. Not how the government, well, what are you, Caucasian, African American? That's not correct. Uncle Sam doesn't know anything. The origins of these people. Yeah.
Uncle Sam just knows money.
Exactly. Okay, so as early as 500 BC, the Scythians established outposts in the Balkans, such as modern-day East Germany, Hungary, Bulgaria, and the Ukraine. This is before the Parthians were conquered and dispersed. Now, in 256 AD, Gothic tribes crossed the Carpathians and drove the Romans from Dacia. Those Dacians that hated the Romans, the Goths helped them out. We're going to find out more about who these Gothic people are. Now, they left the region north of the Black Sea and crossed the Carpathian Mountains and entered Balkan Europe, those places the Scythians established outposts in before in formidable numbers. Those Goths were growing a very big army. Now, since the Parthians had a habit of taking refuge with the Scythians, some of these refugees became known as the Getae. Remember the Massa Getae? Many Israelites fleeing the Black Sea region called themselves Gothae or Goth, which became the Goths. We're going to find out more what those words mean in a bit. Now, the Goths ended up being subjugated by the Romans too. And were subject. See, the Romans, I don't know if they realize who these people are, or they do eventually. The same people they've been fighting with all along. You know, it's happening all over again. These people are all going back to their original roots and their enemies. So, some of the other people that migrated through the Caucasus Mountains when the Parthians went through there were called the Teutons, the Vandals, or the Saxons, and remember some Greek historians called the Saxons. Saxon is actually a derivative which means Sax sons. The sons of Isaac, right, which is what the Scythians call themselves. And so then we go to the, oh, someone needs to go to the next slide. Yeah?
You're all set.
Next slide.
Okay. Now, Ptolemy is cited mentioning the Scythian people that sprung from the Saki, all the Saxons. Again, another historians confirming all these jumbled up terms. Now, as early as 186 AD, the Saxons were recorded as being in the neck of the Cimbric Peninsula. Remember that term, Samaria? Which the Cimbric Peninsula is actually modern Denmark. You'll see a new map about this in a bit. Now, after the fall of the Parthian Empire, the Saki refugees poured into their old migratory routes in search of homelands. Because, you know, after the Parthian Empire fell, these people had to run for their lives. So now the Goths, they were preoccupied with messing with Rome. Again, they didn't have a beef with Rome out of the clear blue sky. There's clearly some ancient history going on here. And the Goths came out of the same area as the Scythians colonized hundreds of years before. Now, the Saxons and their allied tribes migrated into Europe around the northern edge of Rome's empire, the part of Europe they ruled. Now, Rome's hold on Breton, now Britain used to be called Breton, and you see that Berit thing again, I'm going to tie that in soon, grew steadily weaker, and Rome eventually had to abandon the prospect of trying to get Britain altogether. There was someone holding these Romans back. We'll find out soon who they were. Now the Saxons eventually displaced the native Britons. So the people you see in Britain today are different than the people that used to be there. Although the Phoenicians and the Israelites, they were colonizing all around. In fact, what used to be called Breton or Great Britain was another place they got those precious metals and stuff from the mines there. So while some Goth outposts had long existed in northern Europe, the Goths were primarily located in the Black Sea region, so where the Scythians used to be, when they began to invade the Roman Empire. So you go to the next slide. Now, at the beginning of the 3rd century AD, the Goths were divided into the Ostrogoths, that was the Eastern Goths, and the Visigoths, or the Western Goths. Now, the Goths, the Germans, but not all Germans, we're going to get to that soon, knock these Nazis down a peg or two. Now, some Germans, the Goths, the Saxons, have all been collectively referred to in history books as the Teutonic people. Has anyone ever heard of the Teutonic Knights? Now, since we all call the Father, and some by their Hebrew names, the Teutonic Knights actually had some influence in why our English Bibles say God and Lord. Really? Now the Gothic language, the original Gothic language, is very much like the oldest form of English, older than Old English. And the Gothic language developed into the various Germanic languages, including modern day English, German, Dutch, Swedish, and Danish. As you know, there's Germanic languages and there's Romance languages like Spanish, Portuguese, French. They all come from somewhere. Now, Goth or Guth is used to describe the deity, which is God or God. Now, Gothe, or excuse me, the term Gut Theoda was found in ancient Gothic literature, which has the same meaning as an Old English word theod, meaning people. So the Goths, literally translated, means the people of God. And we know God is a pagan term, but once again, this is some clue as to who their common ancestry was. Now, the Teutonic Knights, just remember all these people, the Goths, some Germans and Saxons, were all called the Teutonic people. And Goth, that's where God came from. The Teutonic Knights eventually started calling Yahweh God, because they were knights, they called him Lord, because the knights are, oh, my Lord. That eventually worked its way into the King James Bible, taking out the Hebrew name of the Father. So you go to the next slide. Kind of interesting. Now this, there is a special sect of Germanic people that were not Israelites. They were Semitic people, they were Assyrians, the enemies of the Israelites. They were called the Karamani or the Carmanians.
Did the rabbi say so?
The Amalek is in with the Romans. Now, there's really no time to get into this, but I'll mention it briefly on what the Third Reich actually was. It's a discussion for another time. But Kerman, or the Kermani, is attached to a city in southern Iran. That is the name of a city in Iran today. Because Assyria used to be in that same area, the Assyrian Empire. Now, when Assyria was crushed by the Scythians in 620 AD, they were attacked from the north and the west, and they fled to the south and east towards Persia. As the centuries passed, the land of Kerman was dominated by Persia, Alexander the Great, the Seleucid Greeks, and finally the Parthians. Now, when it mentions Alexander the Great and Persia, I'm not going to guess now, but this relates, in my opinion, to the 4 beasts of Daniel. And so anyway, an ancient inscription from about 800 BC was found in the Assyrian capital of Assur. And Assur was one of the sons of Shem, one of Noah's sons. That's where the Assyrians come from. Now this inscription recorded that Sargon I claimed to rule the Tin Land, which lies beyond the Upper Sea, or the Mediterranean. The Carmanians, or the Kermani, the Germani, were a warlike, militaristic nation like the Assyrians. And the Carmanians eventually migrated into an area of Asia Minor called Prussia. And remember, the early German empires were the Prussian kingdom, right before Hitler.
Right.
So you see, this is how they're retarded, is because Hitler, they're like, oh yeah, we're Israelites, and they abuse some of this information. It's like, that guy you idolize was not a Hebrew. He was a Goy. He was an Assyrian. And this ties into the books of Daniel and Revelation. And that's a discussion for another time. But the very people that enslaved their ancestors, the dude they kissed the butt of, which is kind of funny. But anyway, so I finished about the Goths, and then we'll close this. The Goths eventually grew so large in numbers that in 235 AD, the Romans started paying tribute to deter Gothic attacks. The Romans weren't scared of the Goths before. They eventually got so big, something scared them to pay them money. Like, don't hurt us. Kind of like the school bully getting your lunch money out of you. And there's a reason why they got scary. And we're going to get to that. Now, once the Romans stopped paying tribute, about 13 years later, the Goths ravaged Roman soil. And the Roman Emperor Decius led an army to oppose the Goths. But he was taken by surprise. The Goths ambushed them, killed the Emperor Decius, and rerouted his army. Now, Decius's body was never found. But I think I missed a slide. But actually the Parthians, when they killed a Roman Empire, they chopped his body up and sent it to the other provinces. So I'm guessing this is what the Goths did, because they're, in the same clan as the Parthians and these ancient enemies of the Romans. Now, once again, we're seeing the same old conflict, nothing new under the sun. So for 15 years, between 253 and 268 AD, the Goths struck a lot of blows to the Romans, such as burning the temple of Diana in Ephesus, but they spared Athens. And why did they leave Athens alone, just like the Scythians left alone Jerusalem? I think I must have been missing some slides, but the Scythians traded with Athens. They were agriculturalists too, and actually sold like 600,000 bushels of corn, I think, in 1 year to Athens. So they had some close ties. That's why the Goths left Athens alone, but just burned the rest of that area. And it seems logical since Athens was a historical trading partner of the Scythians. Now, up until about 376 AD, the Visigoths were divided into separate tribes ruled by their own judges. The Gothic kings were chosen by free elections from any of the noble families. Just like the Parthians and just like the Hebrew judges system we saw in Carthage, exhibiting some traits of their old roots. Now, the Goths didn't have much cavalry, but isn't this the same kind of armor we saw the Parthians and the ancient Israelites wearing? So when these armies got huge and the Romans saw them roaming around, they're like, oh crap, it's these guys again. And they had to give them money. Like, don't hurt us. Everyone remembers who everyone is. So you go to the next slide. And this is the old slide. Try the other one. Yeah, this is the last slide. We're going to wrap this up.
Oh, you went too far.
Yeah, this one. Now, in 410 AD, the Visigoths, under their king Alaric, conquered and occupied the city of Rome. Alaric even conquered most of Greece, and the Goths once again spared Athens. And Athens ended up paying them tribute money out of gratitude and gave Alaric a banquet. And Alaric was even made a military governor by the emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire, Constantinople. So the Romans had a treaty with Alaric, and they broke it. You see how they always break treaties with these same people? They did the Parthians. And so the Romans killed 30,000 Goths and their families, including women and children. And Rome had to pay 5,000 pounds of gold and 30,000 pounds of silver and other costly items as reparations. Once again, the Romans were taught they're civilized and respectable people, and the Goths, the Parthians, the Scythians, the Carthaginians are barbarians. But who's the barbarians? Breaking treaties, killing women and children. And there was another slide missing. Actually, the Romans, they desecrated the tombs of Parthian emperors and priests and just defiled the bodies. They're the real barbarians. But they write the history books, so they look good. So in 428 AD, the Arsacid dynasty rule in Armenia finally ended. And so all traces of Parthia pretty much disappeared from there. So in 455 AD, the Vandals, another subdivision of the Goths, sailed across the Mediterranean and conquered the city of Rome once again. All the gold and silver and valuable possessions were taken. Among the spoils that the Vandals took from the Romans were a 7-branched candlestick. You don't know what that is, right? Menorah. It's after the Romans, sacked the temple, and they took back many artifacts from the temple. Why were the Vandals so concerned about these artifacts? Now, by this time, they lost a lot of the idea of who they were. But the Goths later became Christians because they were intermingled with the Romans at Alaric. That was a couple hundred years after Constantine. And the Teutonic Knights eventually called Yahweh God and Lord and changed the Bible. So we see these, this little interest in historical roots. And to close, we're going to wrap this up. No, go back. We're going to wrap this up in about 15 minutes. In 533 AD, the Vandals were defeated by the Romans, and they went back to Carthage and occupied that area for almost a century. In the same area, some of the other Semitic people went. Now at this point, 533 AD, the migrations of all these people pretty much disappeared. But with everything we know, and the clues we're going to see in Genesis 49, we're going to find out where these people went. At least, now not all the people. What we're going to find in Genesis 49 is each tribe was promised a specific nation. That doesn't mean there's not Israelites other places. We're just going to get down to what nation.